The film begins with the atmosphere of the Vosges forest in France, where a little boy named Lucas is undergoing hard training from his father named Louis to hold a wooden carriage, although he is no longer strong. But Louis, who does not want his son to become flabby, continues to increase the weight, but Lucas can't hold it anymore and finally releases it. Louis, who saw that, was immediately angry and slapped Lucas. This harsh treatment made Lucas hurt and disgusted, so he immediately ran away from his father. While on the other hand, Lucas's best friend named Matthias looks very happy when he gets a new bike from his father. However, her excitement instantly turned to worry as she saw Lucas galloping into the forest. Matthias rushes after his best friend, but Lucas suddenly slips and falls. As Matthias approaches Lucas, he is surprised to see Lucas' cheeks red from his father's slap. The two of them were then distracted by an old war-era bunker located not far from where they were. Curiously, the two of them decided to go straight into it. A moment later, Lucas' sadness begins to fade after being content to play with his best friend in an old bunker. After feeling better, Lucas, who did not want his parents to worry, immediately said goodbye to go home. At that time, Matthias asked Lucas to fight back if his father continued to commit acts of violence. The next day, on the way, Lucas' father, who felt his mouth was sour, asked Lucas to get him a cigarette. However, Lucas, who had been warned by his mother not to serve the request because his father had promised to quit smoking, immediately refused. Suddenly, Louis, who is not focused on driving, bumps into Matthias, who is cycling. In a panic, Louis immediately checked Matthias' condition. When he realizes Matthias has been killed, Louis, instead of taking responsibility, tries to eliminate the evidence by throwing Matthias' bike and Matthias' body into a ravine, then immediately returning to his car. Louis, who realized Lucas saw the incident, seemed to ask Lucas to keep it a secret from anyone with a meaningful look, making Lucas feel scared and confused. A short time later, a man named Francis looks panicked and asks Louis for the whereabouts of his son, Matthias. Francis was worried because Matthias had not been home since morning while cycling. However, Louis, who has bumped into Matthias, pretends to know nothing and reveals that he has no information about Matthias' whereabouts. After that, Louis immediately said goodbye to leave. However, Francis was astonished when he saw Lucas, who was crying, as if harboring something. Long story short, 20 years later, Lucas wakes up from a dream that may carry old memories. Now, Lucas is an adult and has a life partner named Julie. However, he gets the shocking news that both his parents have died in a fire. Julie and her best friend Arnaud accompany Lucas to the funeral of his dead parents. After the funeral procession was over, Lucas could only be silent when he saw the ruins of his burnt house. He felt very sorry because there was not a bit of inheritance that his parents could leave for him. Lucas breaks into the warehouse and finds an old game machine, intending to take it with him as the only memory he can keep of his old home. In the middle of the process of clearing things, Lucas looks awkward when he returns to meet Francis, the father of his late best friend, who now uses a wheelchair. After meeting Arnaud and Julie, Francis apologizes for not being able to attend the funeral. Francis then invited Lucas and his two friends to stop by and have a coffee at his house, because he had not met Lucas, who was a close friend of his late son. Although Lucas tries to refuse, Julie feels bad and immediately accepts the invitation. Finally, Lucas asks Arnaud to put things in order and catches up with him at Francis' house. A short time later, they arrive at Francis' house, followed by Arnaud, who also gets there. Arnaud was amazed to see Francis' strength as the grandfather climbed the stairs of his house in his wheelchair. Inside the house, Francis, who lived alone after the death of his son and wife, began to recount the beginning of his paralysis. Francis, who works as a woodcutter, one day had an accident and was hit by a wooden train that he was carrying down the mountain. Julie was curious about how the wooden carriage worked, and Francis immediately took them to his workshop to show them firsthand. When he arrived at the workshop, Francis immediately showed his machine tools to them. But Julie, who was too close, was almost hit by the chainsaw. Francis asked Julie to be careful. Then Francis asked Lucas to get his miniature wooden train. After seeing the shape of the wooden car, Arnaud felt if this car is not as terrible as Francis said. Hearing their comments, Francis said, "It is impossible for a child of today to understand before he has experienced it himself." Upon returning home, Francis asks them to wait while he will take something to show Lucas. A moment later, Lucas, who was about to enjoy coffee, immediately pensive when he saw Matthias's T-Rex glass on the table. Apparently, the glass reawakens old traumatic memories for Lucas, reminding him of an incident that happened 20 years ago. The look in Lucas' empty eyes showed how much the old wounds were still firmly embedded in him. When Francis returned, apparently the contents of the box he brought were photos of Lucas and Matthias together. Francis said affectionately that Lucas was already his own son. However, that happiness soon fades as he reveals the tragedy that has befallen his family. Matthias falls into a ravine with his bike, and his wife, unable to accept the fact, decides to end her life. Hearing Francis' confession, Lucas could only hold back tears while harboring guilt over the tragic secret he had been hiding all along. In a short time, Lucas said goodbye to Francis to go home in the midst of an atmosphere that was still full of sadness. Arnaud asks Lucas to leave immediately, but when he is about to leave, Lucas's car breaks down. Francis, who was aware of the problem, said he would call a mechanic to help fix Lucas' car. Francis went inside to call the mechanic. Lucas was a little suspicious of Francis's behavior, but he didn't pay it much attention. After the call, Francis tells Lucas that the mechanic he called will come tomorrow to fix the car. Hearing that, Arnaud, who did not want to waste time, tried to repair his car as much as possible. After checking the car's engine, Arnaud realizes that the radiator hose is broken and asks Francis to find a life-size hose. Francis then took Arnaud to his workshop to find a life-size hose. However, arriving at the workshop, Francis suddenly knocks Arnaud unconscious. As it turned out, all this was part of Francis' plan to avenge the death of his son. A moment later, Lucas is surprised to see Arnaud leaving in Francis' car. Lucas and Julie go straight to Francis' workshop and ask where Arnaud has gone. At that time, Francis, who had sent someone disguised as Arnaud, revealed that Arnaud had borrowed his car to buy radiator hoses. Even though he was surprised, Lucas tried to believe the explanation. In the afternoon, because Arnaud was not coming, Francis offered that Lucas and Julie could use Matthias' room to rest. Since they had no choice, they accepted it. Arriving at Matthias' room, Lucas, still haunted by guilt, again sees Matthias' increasingly terrible figure, which makes him difficult to sleep and feel uneasy. In the middle of the night, Lucas feels very sorry and is seen leaving the house and regrets his actions that have helped his father hide his crimes. Just then, Lucas saw the workshop door open and his curiosity made him curious to see what was inside. With a pounding heart, Lucas entered the workshop. Then, unexpectedly, Lucas discovers a secret basement door in Francis' workshop. When Lucas realized Francis was coming, he immediately hid. After Francis leaves, a curious Lucas rushes to check into the secret basement. However, without realizing it, Francis was already aware of Lucas' actions and secretly watched from afar. Francis lets Lucas get deeper and deeper caught up in his curiosity, unaware of the approaching danger. After searching the secret room, Lucas was shocked and confused when he found his parents held captive by Francis in that place. However, suddenly Francis came from behind and struck him unconscious. While at home, an awakened Julie rushes to find Lucas' whereabouts. When he entered Francis's room, he immediately felt surprised and shocked when he found a design that looked like a torture device made by Francis. Meanwhile, it is revealed that the paralysis Francis has experienced so far is just an act to launch his action. Now, Lucas and his parents must undergo a terrible game that has been prepared by Francis, a game that is designed with a very sadistic and deadly, making them trapped in fear. In the midst of preparing for the gruesome game, Francis' disillusionment and hatred for Lucas is further inflamed when he realizes that Lucas has covered up the cause of Matthias' death. Those memories came back to haunt him when by chance, the wood Francis was carrying rolled under Louis' car, and there he found Matthias's bicycle rope stuck. The tragic reminder made Francis even more angry and convinced that Lucas would have to pay dearly for his negligence. Now Lucas and his parents are forced to play a game of death as Francis' revenge spirals out of control. Until after the preparations are complete, Francis reveals that the tool he designed will make Lucas and his family finish each other in the death game. But when he is about to execute, he is distracted after hearing Julie's voice. Francis rushes on a hunt to catch Julie. Julie, who realized Francis' crime, immediately took action, hitting him hard until Francis fell. However, Francis, who turned out to be very strong and tough, got up again with a face full of anger and went after Julie. Luckily, Julie was able to escape into the room, locking the door and pushing the small cupboard that was there. In the midst of such a precarious state, a panicked Julie tried to call for help, but the efforts were in vain. When she saw Francis, who had almost managed to open the bedroom door, Julie had no other choice but to take a big risk. He decided to jump out of the window and threw himself to the ground. In the midst of the pain and heavy breathing from the fall, Julie was shocked and panicked when she saw Francis standing in front of her and immediately took him. While in the basement, Lucas is faced with his father's anger, where if Lucas would have given a cigarette, maybe all this would not have happened. Lucas was disgusted by the remarks of his father, who always pointed the finger at him and said, "As a result of 20 years of you being an uncaring father, Lucas must now be haunted by guilt." Hearing Lucas's words that seemed right, Louis also intended to make a sacrifice, especially his wife was no longer strong to hold the rope.
Matilda!
Louis died in front of his wife and children. In the midst of panic, Lucas, who did not want his father's sacrifice to be in vain, asked his mother to immediately remove the restraints on his legs. With trembling hands, his mother tried to untie the leash, and just at the crucial moment, when the deadly device designed by Francis almost hit Lucas, his mother managed to release the restraint. While on the other hand, Francis intends to get rid of Julie, who has become an eyewitness to his atrocities. However, luckily Lucas came and tried to fight Francis with all his might. Having managed to render Francis helpless, Lucas rushes to free Julie from her bonds. However, Francis, who had regained consciousness and was angry, immediately attacked Lucas again. Julie still continues to try to untie her own knot. When Francis continued to beat Lucas, Julie, who managed to escape, immediately hit Francis with a hammer. In a short time, they immediately locked Francis in a basement and tried to save Lucas' mother. However, Lucas' overly dramatic mother made the situation even more complicated and time-consuming. The situation becomes even more precarious when Francis finally regains consciousness and tries to attack Lucas' mother's leg, injuring her. Luckily, Lucas and Julie were able to act quickly and bandage her mother's wounds. However, their fears were not over as Francis attempted to break in the door. Panicking, Lucas, Julie, and his mother immediately flee into the woods. There was also a moving chest that turned out to be Arnaud. An angry Francis took his sickle and began to look for Lucas and his family. However, when he saw Arnaud trying to escape, Francis immediately hit him with a jerry can. Back at Lucas, in the midst of panic and fear, Lucas took the initiative to take his mother into the old bunker where he played his childhood, hoping to find a safe place. Upon arrival at the darkened bunker, Lucas rushed in search of matches to light the light. However, when the flames illuminate the room, they are both in severe shock when they find the body of Matthias that has been preserved by Francis in that place. However, Francis, who already knew the whereabouts of their hideout, immediately locked it, which made them panic even more. On the next day, Julie, realizing Francis has opened the bunker door, rushes to wake Lucas and tells him to go out for help. However, he panicked when he saw Arnaud, who was holding the wooden carriage. Realizing that it was a trap designed by Francis, Lucas ran to help Arnaud. However, Julie, who came out of the bunker, was beaten and captured by Francis, who was lurking. When Lucas tries to help Arnaud, he is shocked to see Julie tied up by Francis in a tree, right on the track of a wooden train ready to hit. Not wanting the two to die, Lucas asks Arnaud to hold the wooden chariot as tight as he can while he will fight Francis to save Julie. With adrenaline running high, Lucas runs towards Francis. Eventually, Francis was killed after being stuck and punctured by a sharp tree branch. However, the tragedy did not stop there. Arnaud, who was not strong enough to hold the wooden carriage, finally ran over and died instantly. Julie, who witnessed the incident, screamed hysterically. Luckily, Lucas was able to react quickly and push the wooden carriage away from Julie, saving her from death. However, in that heroic act, Lucas had to pay dearly. He felt extreme pain when punctured by a wooden carriage plate and eventually died after making a daring rescue to save Julie. In short, the police team that came to the scene immediately collected the bodies of the victims and evacuated Julie and Lucas's mother, who were the two survivors of the bloody incident. Holding her stomach, Julie can only cry because apparently she has conceived a child from Lucas so that the film ends.